So let's take a look at adherence, the thing that has brought us all here today. It's pretty simple overall. It just measures how closely your agents follow their schedules. In a very simple example here, if your agent is scheduled for 100 minutes and they stick to that schedule for 90 minutes, then they have an adherence of 90% for the day. That's not terribly complicated when you look at it overall, but it gets a little bit more complicated when we break it down. So let's take a look at the example here when we got a very simple scheduled shift, then an actually worked shift below it as well. And you can see the two parts on this very simple shift that would matter to the adherence and get that 10 minutes off of their schedule. And at the beginning of it, you can see here that the agent, they started their shift about 3 minutes late. Then they were logged in for a long chunk of time. They went to lunch. That was a little bit late. And then they came back a little bit late. We will cover the difference on those two late parts on the lunch segment here. And then they were logged in again as well. You can see that they went past their standard shift time a little bit, and we'll cover that as we get to conformance, and then we dive into another example here in a bit. But that is the overall gist of adherence. Like I said, it's not a terribly complicated topic to go over. However, this is a very compressed and very small example. As you can see, you scale this up to hundreds or thousands of agents. They don't only log in, go to lunch, and then log back on. They have many different things they do throughout the day. It can get a lot more complicated in this example here. So I'm going to just jump over to the, let's call it the cousin to adherence here. This is conformance, another very important metric. They are both very useful, but sometimes they do get confused for each other. So let's just outline what this is to help better inform you on what adherence is. And conformance itself just tracks how many total productive hours are delivered by the agents during their scheduled time. So for example here, if you've got an agent scheduled to work 100 minutes, they work for 110 minutes, their schedule conformance is 110%. It's interesting here, conformance is one of the metrics that can go over 100%, and that's not a problem. So let's take a look at that same example that we had here. We have your scheduled shift and the actually worked shift as well. The agent was 3 minutes late to start. Conformance is the total amount of hours that they worked. Since their lunch, it's not outlined completely clearly here, but let's say the lunch was the same 60 minutes of that shift. Even though it's offset from where it should have been during the day, it is still the total amount of time that was taken out of their productive shift. So there's not an impact there, even though it's offset. But then that agent stayed 13 minutes past the end of their shift. Now, this is where you see there's that extra 10 minutes and you get that 110% conformance. There are many different variations to this. Sometimes people will go in and actually change the shift schedule so that you don't go over 100% conformance. If you drag the schedule out here, sometimes it's just okay to leave it as is, and you have a metric that goes over 100%. There is not anything wrong with that, just another way to look at it here. So let's go to an example now that we've dove into what the two metrics are. Once again, pretty simple on the face of it, but it does get a little bit more complicated in the real world. So we've got our agent here. Our agent is James Bond. James Bond, they have a scheduled shift from 9 to 1800, pretty nice shift. They got a 1 hour lunch and 2 15-minute breaks during the day. But as we know, thwarting those international villains, it takes longer than expected, and they come to work 15 minutes late. It happens to the best of us, especially when your Aston Martin breaks down. During their shift, they are 5 minutes late to the first and the second break. However, they come back from their second break 5 minutes early, and then they also stay 10 minutes past the end of their shift to offset being tardy. What is James's adherence and conformance for the day? So a few different things happened during this shift. Obviously, there was the late arrival, the Aston Martin broke down or needed gas. There were the breaks and the lunch to look at throughout the day. And then they were late to those. However, on one of them, they came back a little early. And then there was the end of the shift staying over. So let me go ahead and click through to the adherence part. So let's take a look here. We've got 450 minutes scheduled for the day, and we'll walk through the math. You just take away 15 minutes for the late, 5 minutes for break one, and that gives you 430 minutes in adherence out of 450 minutes scheduled. It's a 95.5% adherence for the day. Now, in the previous example here, the agent, James Bond, was late to both breaks by 5 minutes. And this is where it gets into a bit of a trickier part. And you have to know that adherence is looking as to what they were, what the agent did compared to their scheduled shift. And in this example, we're looking at compared to their productive events for the day, not all events of the day. So when James Bond came back from that shift 5 minutes earlier, the second shift, there was no hit to adherence after that. If you can think of if the break started at, let's say, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they go at 4:05, well, from 4 to 4:05, the system really didn't care as much that they were kind of still on a call because they weren't impacting their productive adherence. But when they should have come back at 4:15, instead of going all the way to 4:20, they came back that 5 minutes early. And here we are. There's no hit to when the productive time or the counter started again. And then they actually came back. So that's why you only get that 20 minutes of hit instead of a 25-minute hit to the adherence for the day. And you get that 95.5% adherence overall. So let's jump over to the conformance of James Bond's schedule here. So the same 450 minutes, we've got the same 15 minutes that were late. However, now we look at that second break again, where Agent James Bond came back a little early. We actually get an additional 5 minutes of productive time because they shrunk down their second break. And that adds on with the 10 minutes that they stayed after. And that gives us to 450 minutes out of 450 minutes, 100% conformance. So even being late and not staying the exact same amount of time after that they were late, they were able to gain that back with that second break. This is one of those examples where you could go over 100% had they stayed even later. But it is important to know here that I am not specifically recommending that agents or that you even coach agents to come back early from break. That's obviously something that HR is probably going to have an opinion on. We'll say that I have seen it happen, and it is a way to adjust that metric, especially if agents are very in tune with what their metric is and trying to hit that. I see that there is a question here from Tom. So a good goal or benchmark for both adherence and conformance. So a little bit different here. Conformance, you want to get really as close to that 100% throughout the day. It may be able to go over that 100%, but really once you start to drop below that, that's when you start to take into account are you tracking all of the actual segments versus your planned segments? Are you tracking those in your system correctly to make sure that it matches up with your conformance? And if you start to see that widening gap, it really throws into question your ability to forecast as you go out, because not only are your hours probably misaligned, adherence, but then they're lower than you expected, the conformance. So conformance as close as you can to that 100%. Adherence, this one is, it can be dependent on your business and the type of contacts you're taking. If you have a 24-hour SLA for email, it's probably not going to be as important that they're hitting, 100% adherence. But it is good to also have that in place so that agents know that, hey, there is a plan and I should stick to it. If you're doing some sort of synchronous channels, then 90 to even 95% adherence is where you should try to be as you average out. Your morning, your entire day, maybe even your entire week is not always going to be there. But if your agents can hit those over their entire month or even their entire quarter, and that's something you can work towards, that really helps bring up the productivity of the site. So thanks for asking that question. So one last little side that I want to cover here before I hand it off to Sheldon is adherence comes off a lot of times as very big brothery, especially when it hasn't been a part of what your business has done before. So it's definitely a good idea to frame this as an agent-friendly metric that is being introduced, and to be sincere about it. It really is an agent-friendly metric and not just some way to have more control over your agents. It does give your agents a quantifiable way to see how well they're doing. It gives an actual number to see the result of their efforts. And then if you've got your team or your site level numbers, then they can see how they compare to the average. I will say from personal experience, when I was an agent, this was one of my favorite metrics because it was a metric that I could control. It was in the rare cases of calls or things or issues with customers that I wasn't able to resolve in the time frame. Sure, my adherence would be off, but for the most part, that is something that an agent can control versus CSATs or something else that may be outside of there. Because of that, it allows for your top performers to be recognized and rewarded. It's a great thing to set up that incentive, and we'll actually cover that in just a little bit more detail later on. And then it, of course, provides much more stability for the business, but the good way to frame that with your agents is not only is it more stability for the business, but it's more stability for the agents because the agents are your business. If you have agents that are working and they continue to see there are those ups and downs, so those peaks and valleys throughout the day, adherence is what helps you smooth that out. And it's a good way to frame and say, hey, maybe we are hiring because we are starting to see that our volume is going up. But we can make things better now by working on this metric and adhering better to it, instead of just, it'll be fixed in the future when these new people come in. Helps with your attrition, helps with a bunch of other metrics there. I see that there are, looks like 2 questions in there. Do we depend on team members like James Bond to self-submit their time, or is this being watched, tracked behind the scene? This is from Kathleen. Great question, because it can go both ways. It depends on your software solution. In software, and you can do this in Assembled, depending on your integrations, then it's going to track it automatically, which is the best thing that you want to do. For one, it takes away, another button that the agent has to press throughout the day. And for their best intentions, it's just hard to click that button and maybe also hang up with the customer and get your notes in and get everything else done. The second part is too, that if agents don't want to be a part of this metric and it's a manual thing, then yes, it's just going to be real tough to not have that done automatically. It looks like it tracks logged in, that is logged into Zendesk customer. Is there a way to look at active instead of logged in? This is from an anonymous one. That's going to be the same thing depending on your integration. And I'll let maybe Valerie or Shelton chime in if they will have a little bit more clarity to add to this, but depends. Some systems say logged in, some systems will have active that you can track. And it depends on what that is able to pass through to Assembled or whatever software solution you're using to track as a productive event and that you have configured and set up. Not everybody plays super nicely with that and passes that data along, but that it can be kind of whichever one you can configure. Obviously, the more granular or the more you can get beyond just logged into active or even like typing and working on ticket, it's going to give you the better result.
And to add a little bit of additional color on Zendesk and customers specifically, so for Zendesk states, we actually pull those directly from Zendesk Talk, chat, or email. But as for customer, you have the ability to customize those states on your end in your customer instance, and then we will just pull those directly into Assembled.
Awesome. Thanks, Val. And I see that there are a couple more questions in here. We've got one that does Assembled look at conformance instead of occupancy. And I'll let Val correct me if I am misstating anything here, but if you have your configuration set up correctly, you're going to be seeing an adherence score come across with your agent adherence there. We actually have a nice screenshot. We didn't want to pull up a live account because that's our demo account is a little messy as we go through that, but we'll show a screenshot of how that actually looks. And then you can see all those log in and log outs throughout the day that we're able to track.
Yes, and then to add to the occupancy piece, we do track occupancy for live channels, phone and chat, and then we track adherence in the agent performance report, but not conformance.